All right. Well, huge congratulations to all of you to make it to the end of the day. We've had such a wonderful day of presentations. I've enjoyed every single one of them, and I sure hope that you guys have enjoyed them as well. If you haven't yet checked out any of the benefits for our subscription program, I highly encourage that. We will be willing to offer you the $199 fee and to flip it into a subscription. We'll extend the deadline to December 23rd. If it's something that you're interested in, by all means, connect with one of the staff members if you have any questions. We will have our annual conference and trade show February 15th and 16th in person at the former Lethbridge Lodge. And apologies for the slight delay. Cristine was just getting herself ready, and she's joined us here now. Are you ready, Cristine? Not quite.
Give me 30 more.
No problem. So Cristine is our next presenter. She's the Chief Scientific Officer at the Soil Health Institute, and she's working to develop a solution to measure and assess soil health. So super excited to hear this presentation. There's all kinds of Canadian initiatives as far as carbon sequestration and reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So it's definitely something that is in the forefront of all of our brains and directing some of the research that's going on here in Canada as well. So whenever you're ready, Cristine, we invite you to share your screen, as long as I remember to change that setting. Yep. So whenever you're ready, we will let you get started.
All right, I'm unmuted.
Yep.
All right, hello everybody. I apologize for the delay. It's all my fault. I remembered this talk all day today until about 3:30 this afternoon, when I started doing something really important and mentally intensive, and then completely forgot about it on the way home. So I'm bringing up a presentation that's going to give me some capability to give you some visuals, but I'm probably going to go off script because this particular presentation is about scaling regenerative ag. And I know today that I'm supposed to be talking about scaling soil health measurement, but a lot of the concepts are the same because at Soil Health Institute, we do believe that soil health is the foundation for regenerative ag. And also, a big component of soil health is soil carbon. And I also understand that there's quite a few producers and maybe trusted advisors to producers out on the call today. And so I don't think that you'll be incredibly disappointed because I think that you probably are, though you're interested in soil carbon and ecosystem service markets, it's all wrapped together right in how we manage our soils, get it scaled. And when we increase our soil organic carbon, we are improving our soil health, and we are implementing regenerative agriculture practices. And these first couple of pictures are probably are pictures that let you know what my biases are when it comes to thinking about scaling and measuring soil health and soil carbon in regenerative agriculture. The first bias is shown by the middle picture, where we see a beautiful photo of a surface soil, and we're looking at its structure, right? And so we see all these little aggregates forming together in between the roots. And those aggregates are so terribly important because as we build our soil health and increase our carbon in soils, we improve the aggregation. And I'm a soil physicist, so I'm very into improving aggregation because it's all about infiltration, plant available water, drought resilience, healthy ecosystems that have water to drink, and drought resilience, so that we have more resilient yields, cleaner water, and soils that stay on the field and don't run off. And then my other bias about scaling agriculture and soil health and soil carbon is that we need to remember that there's people involved in all of this. This is really about managing the land, and we're managing the land for food and fiber production. And people are making decisions, and people are making a living off the land. And always try to keep that in mind and not claim to be dropping in and going to save everyone, but that we need to listen and think and figure out solutions that are generally very local because soils are local, cropping systems are local, and weather and climate are local as well. So that's just kind of give you, you got all of my philosophy there. I'm the Chief Scientific Officer at the Soil Health Institute. We are a small nonprofit. Right now, we have about 20 employees, full-time employees. Most of the people you see in this picture are soil scientists or biogeochemists or some sort of agriculturally bent soil scientists. We have an ag economist and people in our development, in our administration. But what you see here are soil scientists, educators, early mid, and later career soil scientists. And we're all dedicated to this mission to safeguard and enhance the vitality and productivity of soil through scientific research and advancement. And we do have a Canadian on the team, since I think a lot of the audience today is Canadian. There's Cam Ogilvie here on the far right, who lives in in Ontario. And so we do have some soil health presence and some work, and very excited to be building out a project kind of based about what I'm going to talk about today in Ontario. Okay, so this slide, because again, I'm so sorry you all, I didn't have a chance to redo my slides. But this is, I thought it's okay, because I think a lot of people are thinking about measuring soil carbon. There's this word called regenerative agriculture out there. And all of these practices, these regenerative ag practices, are the ways that we're going to increase our soil carbon. So might as well start out with a little definition of regenerative ag. And there isn't one definition. And I think everybody holds in their heart a different definition based on your experience, your observations, and your goals with your production systems. But the interesting thing in this review I thought was really useful, because there's all sorts of different ways to talk about regenerative ag. And this kind of review put it kind of an academic slant on it, saying, well, most people, when they define regenerative ag, they're either talking about processes or outcomes. So process would be, we want to reduce chemical input. You want to improve living roots, the amount of time that there's living roots or something like that, right? And an outcome is really about, like, why are you doing regenerative ag? Do you want to increase your carbon? Do you want to enhance and restore the agricultural ecosystem? Do you want a greater return on your investment and more profit in your field? So there's a lot of reasons for regenerative ag. And while I said soil health is the foundation of regenerative ag, we think about profit and economics. That is a component of regenerative ag and soil health too, because we believe and we have evidence that shows that you reduce your inputs, adopt regenerative agricultural practices, that you are making more money per acre than those that are practicing conventional agriculture. And I don't remember if it's in this presentation, but if it's not, I'll talk about that, because I think generally people are very interested in that component. In fact, in corn and soy production in the Midwest, on average, we found over 100 we interviewed over 100 farmers that had adopted soil health management systems in the Midwestern United States. They were corn and soy, so the adoption of the systems was primarily reduced tillage and cover cropping, but generally people that adopt those are kind of looking at it more holistically, those that have successfully made those two practices work. And we found on average that they were making $50 more an acre in their corn and their soy. I think corn is $52 more an acre, soy is $46 more an acre, but roughly $50 an acre more profit having implemented regenerative ag practices. And that's regenerative ag too, right? Because we talk about the improvement of the farming ecosystem and also the improvement in the health of communities, of rural communities. And good economics improves the health of rural communities. If we're going to increase soil carbon, we're going to adopt some practices. And a lot of these practices, will improve biodiversity. We might want to be thinking about community well-being, as I was just talking about, economic health, and then the soil health, which is our foundation. And when we talk about soil health, I'm talking about that you can have all soils can be healthy. So I don't care if you have a sandy soil, a clayey soil, a weathered soil, a thin soil, a thick soil, all soils can be healthy. And here's an example of a nice mollisol in northern South Dakota, I believe. So probably similar to some landscapes that you have in that part of Canada. And we have the same exact soil. It's under different management. On the right-hand side, we have stubble over the ground. On the left-hand side, we have the soil is exposed. It's probably a conservation tillage program versus a no-till program. We have soybeans that have been planted. And we can see after this rainfall, on the left-hand side, we have erosion of soil, we have deposition, we have surface sealing, and a lot of things going on that show that the soil hydraulic cycle is not very healthy and not functioning well to produce the biomass or this crop, because you can also see variability in the crop stand, where on the right-hand side, the crop stand is fairly homogeneous. And also, many of you can imagine if I said you needed to get a tractor out on this field today, the field on the right-hand side would be more conducive and more trafficable than the field on the left-hand side. So big point here is when we're talking about soil health and improving soil carbon, it is scalable because it might take more effort and it might take some learnings, but it's going to improve water cycling. It's going to reduce inputs that are needed to grow the crop. And it's going to increase your soil carbon. So these are just, thinking about this big picture holistically, that functionally this is scalable, recognizing that in specific locations, we're going to have to perform different practices or plant differently, choose different cover crop varieties, plant and terminate the cover crop in different ways, as an example. This is another example of the idea in a grazing land. So again, we have the fence line that goes through on the left-hand side, some more conventional continuous grazing. On the right-hand side, rotational grazing. You all can see the difference in plant cover, but the real difference here that to me is most remarkable is if we look at these two soils, you can see a big difference in the thickness and the aggregation and the carbon in the soil that's in the rotational grazing system versus the continuous grazing system. We have more carbon in our rotational grazing system. So we can think about, are the practices that create this scalable? There could be some debate on it because maybe rotational grazing has a little bit more labor in it. But if you're looking to increase your soil carbon, it's very clear which of the practices have greater soil carbon in them. So this is some of the work that we did on economics. We had, I said, 100 farms assessed in states where 71% of corn and 67% of the soybeans are grown in the United States. We interviewed these 100 farmers. 97% reported increased crop resilience due to extreme weather. A lot of that had to do with the ability of the plant and emergence. 85% of the farmers reported their net income increased for growing corn and soybean. 67% reported higher yield. You notice that's much lower than the ones that talked about an income and increase in income. And that's because in some situations, the yield wasn't greater, but still the inputs are less, so you're getting more return on investment. And here are those dollars, 52 acres for corn and $45 an acre for soybean. That's overall increased net farm income by acre. And on this bottom left-hand circle, we have $24 and $17 for corn and soy. And that's the reduced average cost of growing corn and soy. Another reason why we think the increasing soil carbon is very scalable is this is the results of our North American project to evaluate soil health measurements. So this was a project where we looked at 124 sites across Mexico, the United States, and Canada. And we, at each of these sites, we had business as usual crop growing practices. And then we had the adoption of some sort of soil health management practice. Many of these were row crops with no-till. Some of them were pasture systems. There was other management like cover cropping, and then also residue retention of the soil surface. And essentially what we found is we know that as the clayier a soil gets, the more water it can hold, but it also the amount of plant available water varies with clay content and silt content. But in this particular example, what we were really excited to see, and I'm not showing you all the data, what I'm showing you are these blue lines that are model fits to the actual data points, and they were statistically significant. And what we found is as we increased the organic carbon, and these soils had changes in organic carbon primarily due to changes in management, we get increased available water holding capacity. And this is not in the units that a farmer could really use, but if we're thinking about, the difference between 2% and 4% organic carbon is roughly half an inch of water, then we can think about every time it rains, and let's say it's a quarter of an inch between a 1% increase in organic carbon. Every time it rains, we have the capability to store an extra quarter inch of plant available water. And that can really add up over growing season, especially helping that soil help the crop not get too stressed in between rainfalls, especially rain-fed systems. So now we're getting to the part of the talk that I think I was really asked to talk about, was how do we scale measurement and assessment of soil health and carbon? If I had taken the opportunity or had found my correct set of presentation, I would just have added "and carbon" right here to the title, so we're pretty good. And essentially, because we know that soil health and carbon are very close, soil and organic carbon are very closely tied. So one of the things that we've done at the Soil Health Institute is we've identified this most effective set of indicators that quantify changes in soil health due to management. So if we treasure it, we want to measure it. So we have identified these measurements, and I'll just tell you what they are. It's in the top 15 centimeters of the soil because that's where we get most of our change in soil health and carbon due to management. So we recommend the top 15 centimeters. If you're engaged in a carbon market, you need to be measuring the top 30 centimeters. So we measure the top 15 just to assess changes in soil health and carbon concentration. And in that top 15 centimeter soil sample, we're measuring carbon concentration, 24-hour respiration or potential carbon mineralization. So essentially you take the soil, you dry it, you put it in a jar, you add some water, and then you cap off the jar and you measure how much CO2 is evolved in that soil over 24 hours. And then the other thing that we measure is aggregate stability, because aggregate stability is that giant integrator of not only how active are our microbes in helping put the puzzle pieces of soil together and make those aggregates that I showed you at the beginning, but then it also integrates the effective tillage and other things. And aggregate stability is telling us something about the health of the microbial population. And it's telling us about the soil's ability to function very well in providing water and drought resilience, as well as not surface sealing and capturing water in between rainfalls. So that partitioning of rainfall and runoff is something that aggregate stability drives a lot. So, okay, so we have this minimum suite of measurements. They're fairly inexpensive. And so now what we need to do is think about a reference for farmers. So it doesn't matter what you measure, you got to go out to the field. If we take these soil health measurements at any farm, the first question someone's going to ask us is like, well, how healthy is, they get the lab results back, right? And you say, well, how healthy is this soil and how healthy can it be? How much carbon is in my soil and how much carbon can I store in my soil? And conceptually, what we like to think about this is that, we can kind of give someone an idea of where they are today and how good their soil can be. But to do this, we have to have a little soil science, which is one of the concepts that we're working on and implementing at a pilot kind of program in the United States and the Cotton Belt. We're doing a program on soil, we call them soil health benchmarks and soil health targets. We're doing this in Iowa, in the southeastern United States and the Cotton Belt. And we're going to try to implement this in Ontario this year. Ontario, Canada. So this is an example of some data. So we have, this is one specific soil, and the soil has been sampled in the spring on the same day. And in the day that this soil was sampled, there had been a big rain the previous day. And so these are pictures of the same soil under different management on the same day. On the left-hand side, the soil is under kind of a business as usual. On the right-hand side, it's under a perennial system. But we also sampled a soil that was under soil health management, meaning that it had a crop rotation, it was no-tilled, and it was cover cropped. And the business as usual is continuous wheat with tillage. So we measured the soil organic carbon, the carbon mineralization, that 24-hour respiration, and the aggregate stability of these soils. And we see for our benchmark, our perennial system, that we have 2.2% organic carbon. We have a lot of mineralization and good aggregate stability. If we look at the business usual, that kind of provides us the other side of the bracket. And here's our soil health management system. It's not all the way to the benchmark, and we wouldn't expect it to be because it's in a row crop. It's not in a perennial system, but it's over halfway there on average. And if we're thinking just about soil organic carbon, and we're thinking about farmers wanting to get into carbon markets or soil managers getting into carbon markets, we could see how we could help someone try to understand if you're here at business as usual and you implement a soil health management system in 15 years, because this was a 15-year-old study, this is where we'd expect to be. This middle blue area is where we would expect to be in a soil health management system. And if we converted to perennial, could be all the way over here on the right. And this can just give us some idea of you know, where you could anticipate being able to improve your soil health on average and improve your soil organic carbon. So this is the concept, right? But we can't do this for every single, in the US, I would call it every single soil series. In Canada, we can't do it for every specific soil. What we need to do is we need to look at our soil maps, look at what we know about soil forming processes, and get in an area and group soils so that we think that they have similar potential to store carbon, and group soils into those same groups that have the similar potential to exhibit soil health. And so, for example, what we've done in a group of counties in the Southeast, and what we're going to do for Ontario, is we're going to look at the soils. Probably we've looked at like 8 soils in the Ontario area that we think have about same 8 different groupings of soils with different soil carbon potential. We're going to go into the area and we're going to measure soils on farms and record the management. We're going to measure some soils in perennial orchards, grass condition, and look at what that carbon and soil health are. And then hopefully we're going to get onto some farms that are doing some regenerative farming practices and create some information such as this for the different soils of Ontario, the different soils of Iowa, the different soils of the Cotton Belt in the southeastern United States, so that then when we want to talk with a farmer or talk with anybody who wants to figure out, well, I have 80 acres of this soil and 200 acres of that soil and 400 acres of this other soil, how healthy is my soil today and how healthy can my soil get? That's a way that we can start to scale, take measurements, compare it to soils on a bulk, and start to scale soil health assessment and soil carbon assessment as well. So that's like the big idea of how we think that we can scale, go into an area, group soils of similar soil health and carbon potential, measure some benchmarks, some business as usual, and some soil health management systems, create this database, and then, for instance, one day, maybe 5 years from now, you could have all this information on your phone and you get your data back from the lab, you plug it in and give it a GPS location, and then something like this comes up with a red dot kind of telling you where you are today, and then you can work with your crop consultant to figure out how far you could get. It's really important when we're thinking about scaling. We know we can measure progress in regenerative ag and soil health and carbon. We think that this soil health targets concept gives us a tool for an agricultural retail portfolio for agricultural retailers, crop advisors, agronomists that want to consult and sell the concept of soil health. We think that soil health targets is a good way to go. It's a tool for conservation planners. It's a tool for also carbon developers as well. So one of the things I did not talk much about is how to measure soil carbon. And I'm happy to cover some of that. I'm not really sure exactly what the primary questions of the audience are, but do you think that we could ask a few questions and then I could certainly go into more detail in answering those questions?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Does anyone have specific questions or concepts or ideas that they want to run by Cristine so she can?
Yeah. Or if you want, I can pull up a presentation on measuring soil carbon.
George, go ahead.
Yes, thanks, Cristine. I guess my question is exactly that, is how do we measure soil carbon?
Okay.
And
George,
maybe you
what
can,
scale do you want to measure soil carbon for a farm, for a region?
I want to be able to measure, I'm an independent agronomist. I work with
Okay.
about 30 growers in southern Alberta, anything from dairy to beef, swine, and a few just grow crops. So I want to be able to go into a field
Okay.
and do something and come back out with a result saying to the farmer, okay, this is your measurement of soil health right now.
Mm-hmm.
And then use your management techniques and then be able to go back a year or 2 years later and say, okay, this is now the measurements and this is what has improved or this is what has changed of those measurements. So I guess to some extent, very similar to what I do right now for nutrient soil testing. I soil sample for my growers to find out what they need to be able to grow a crop. How do we do this for this concept of soil health?
Okay, gotcha. Great. I can cover that. I'm going to share my screen. Let's see if I can find my Google search. All right, so I just want to make sure. Okay, I'm sharing my my search engine, right? So you can see me on the internet. Can you see that?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. So I just typed in Soil Health Institute. So I'm going to pop to the Soil Health Institute's webpage, and I'm going to go to our work initiatives. Okay. Recommended measurements for scaling soil health. I'm going to click on that. And this whole landing page, we hope, are sufficient resources for you to decide how you want to deal with your soil health and talking to your farmers and also the carbon. So the first thing I want to show you is I gave you a concept about soil health measurements, but if we click on the recommended measures for scaling soil health fact sheet, you have a little bit about the North American project to evaluate soil health measurements, so it gives you some background on it. But we talk about the recommended measures for soil health indicators. And we talk about soil organic carbon concentration, carbon mineralization. So these are like what the measurements are, aggregate stability. And then we talk a little bit about predicting or plant available water, which I also showed you. So if you ever want to learn more about these specific measurements, you can come to this fact sheet. But now what I'm going to do is click on this link to organic carbon, inorganic carbon. Oh, wait, I want to do that. I'm going to click on this fact sheet, details of how laboratories can analyze soil carbon. And what we have here are very clear standard operating procedures that the Soil Health Institute asks labs to follow when we're measuring soil carbon. So one of the first things that you'll recognize, probably if you work a lot in fertility, George, you'll take a soil sample, right, to 15 centimeters, or I'm sorry, okay, I guess we're in Canada, we can do centimeters, right?
Yep, 15 centimeters.
Yeah, so how many centimeters do you take your fertility samples to?
Well, we do 0 to 15, and also 0 to 24 inches, which is 60 centimeters, I guess. Mainly
Okay.
for the more mobile nutrients, deeper, obviously less mobile nutrients to go to the 0 to 15.
Okay, so if you're really just focused on soil carbon, what I would suggest is you take a composite sample from 0 to 15 and a composite sample from 15 to 30, because your farmers, if they're interested in developing a carbon market, those are the 2 depth increments they're going to want. Okay. The next thing is most commercial soil labs give you organic matter, and the measurement that they're using is loss on ignition. And loss on ignition is not, it is sufficient for you to talk with your farmer about whether or not their carbon is increasing or decreasing over time, but it's not a sufficient measurement for your farmer to engage in a carbon market. If you want to engage in a carbon market, you need to do this total soil carbon by dry combustion. And so the information on that procedure is here in this standard operating procedure. And if you want to visit with your lab about it, you can just print this out or send it to your lab and ask them if they do that.
Excuse, Cristine, one question. What do you consider a soil carbon market? You've mentioned that a few times. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, so in the United States, we have these voluntary carbon markets that are developing. And they're paying farmers $20 to $25 an acre for the farmers to change their practices. And if they measure the soil carbon at the beginning, and then 5 years from now, they'll come back and measure it again. And they make a payment to the farmer for increasing their soil carbon. And those measurements are 0 to 15 and 15 to 30 centimeters. In Canada, I don't think that is a big of a deal yet. I don't think that's kind of hit you guys.
Well, for my concern is, how can I make my growers more profitable? Now, if there is a carbon market, great. But right now, let's assume there's not a carbon market in Canada. So
yeah,
and I want to make my farmers, try to make them more money, make them more profitable.
Yeah. Okay. So then I would measure their organic carbon concentration. I still wouldn't use loss on ignition, because you could be taking soil samples from many of your farms, and if you all compare them with loss on ignition, they're not very comparable, because as soil properties change, loss on ignition changes. So I would actually measure the carbon concentration. And then the next thing that I would measure is I would measure aggregate stability. And information on this aggregate stability measurement, we're working on improving the app, but there is currently a smartphone app that you can download, and it's called Slakes, SLAKES. And that can give you information. And that's a measurement you don't have to take the soil back to the laboratory to make. And it's a very good measurement that you can make yourself in your kitchen table. My daughter did it for her science fair project, and you can measure aggregate stability over time. Those aggregate stability measurements, they're just like pea-sized clods from your field, and you can collect 2 or 3 of those in the top couple of centimeters. But we have all the instructions for that too, all on this resource. I want to talk a little bit more about sampling for soil aggregate stability and soil carbon, but I think there's another question here. Guvir, Dylan?
Yes, I had a question about measuring soil carbon. In endocropping systems, especially, changes in carbon can take a bit of time. It can happen, sometimes not happen even on medium-term scales. So is there a proxy measurement that the farmers can use if they want to see if they're making any progress in those 3 to 5 years? And my other...
Let me answer that one first. I'll answer
Okay.
that one. Aggregate stability is a good proxy, but you should, if you're increasing your soil organic carbon and you're using dry combustion, which is this top method here that I just talked about, that we have the SOP, you will be able to detect differences in carbon over time. Usually the first 3 years, you ought to start being able to detect differences in carbon if you're increasing your soil carbon. But, you know, just like George was talking about, he wants to make his farmers more profitable. Aggregate stability is a really good other measure, because it's measuring more than carbon. It's measuring, is your soil structure improving? And where your soil structure improves, your soil drains better, your soil holds better, more plant available water, your soil is more trafficable, you're not eroding your soil. There's so many things associated with aggregate stability that link to profitability and stability in farming, that I think the aggregate stability measurement is a really useful one beyond soil carbon. If I had to pick one of these to measure in my farm's field, I'd measure the aggregate stability. Okay, you had another question.
You've partly answered it actually, but I was going to ask that, is bulk density an important measure, especially if they're trying to estimate carbon changes in carbon?
If you want to measure carbon stock, so the actual mass of carbon in your field, you need to measure carbon concentration and bulk density. But I think as a general rule, bulk density measurements are difficult to make, and they're only really needed for to sell your carbon. So unless you're entering into a carbon market, I would recommend just measuring concentration. You just have to be very careful that you're measuring the same thickness of soil every time. You don't want to go deeper one year and shallower the other, because that's where a lot of your variability will come from in your measurement. And you definitely also want, just like when you take a fertility measurement, you do a composite sample, you definitely want to make sure you do a good composite sample.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Christine,
Yes,
further to the conversation I was having, okay, I went out there and sampled one of my growers' fields, or a few of them. How do I know how much room for improvement there is based on what's already there, based on that measurement?
So what I would do, George, is I would probably, I don't know, I mean, I'm going to assume that you have decent understanding of soil texture and drainage class and all these components that contribute to yield. But these are like inherited components of the soil, like where it is on the landscape and what the soil texture is. So if I went out to a field, I would do exactly what I just talked about with soil health benchmarking. I would go to a farmer's field and get an idea of the variability of their soils. I would pick their most representative soil and their most representative field, and I would soil sample that for carbon. But then what I would do is I would go try to find a fence line. I would maybe find an orchard, find a prairie remnant, or anything that is in ideal soil health management conditions, meaning it's not physically disturbed, it's not being plowed, it has living roots in it as many days of the year as it possibly can, so preferably a perennial something, some sort of a hay field, an area that cows graze. I would not pick some place that's overgrazed. I would just look for a healthy soil example, and I would take that soil sample too. So I would send 2 soil samples to the lab. George, you're on mute.
Is yield a good indicator of soil health?
No.
No? Okay.
No. There's so many factors that go into yield, right? Was there good fertility? When did you plant? When did you harvest? What was the weather like? So if you just use yield to evaluate your soil health, there's so much variability that goes into that. You don't know what you're evaluating. I think that yield stability and trafficability, penetration resistance, the soil structure is really the best way to evaluate soil health.
And I'm not talking about soil yield for 1 year. I'm talking overall yield on over a number of years. So yield is not, okay,
No.
thank you.
Yeah, I don't think so. I think it's dangerous, George. I think that there's so many factors that contribute to yield. If I were talking to my farmer about soil health, I would start looking at return on investment. I can show y'all the economics. Would y'all like to see the partial budget economics? Or would you believe it because it's American?
I think, Jamie, that's your call.
If anybody is, yeah, let's see it. Yeah.
Yeah, if I don't get any questions, you guys, we're gonna go back. I'm gonna show you some stuff. But you can holler out a question while I'm finagling my share screen.
Yeah, I hate
wanna
economics, so
say-
I'm going to ask a question.
Okay, one more, George. I went to the resources page of that measurements website. You can really geek out on our peer-reviewed publications, but I think what's really useful here is that we talk about soil health sampling standard operating procedure, like where to go into the field and how we would measure soil health, like so the real technical, physical thing. But it's very laid out in a fact sheet that I think that it's going to be very close to fertility sampling, but not quite. And then all of those standard operating procedures are right here. Okay, Ken, I'm ready.
Thanks, Christine. Soil health is obviously, big thing these days, and I worry about, our confusion over what it is. And I agree, aggregate stability is a good one, but it's directly related to tillage. So what I've seen, throughout my career is, yeah, aggregate stability improves when you move towards zero till. But I was recently in France, and today we've had a lot of speakers from Europe and all of these environmental schemes, and we like to talk about soil health as so important, but then these schemes that they have in place, and then trying to get rid of glyphosate and those types of things. I was out in France where I've never seen more tillage in my life, and they were out there doing their aggregate stability tests and their carbon tests, and because they grew a cover crop, then oh yes, I'm doing a good job. But I think we kind of tend to get a lot of misconceptions around organic carbon, and like people like to brag about a number. So I'm just wondering if we're not, say, focused too much on carbon or too much in one system versus another, especially when we're only measuring carbon typically in this top 6 inches. And then in those scenarios, they'll plow it under, and now you've diluted the organic carbon deeper within the soil. So I just was wondering if you could comment on some of those challenges that we have in soil health.
Yeah. The Europeans love to till because they don't want to use chemicals. And so, of course, that's their choice of weed management. There's pros and cons. In organic systems, conceptually, folks think that they're healthy, the soil is healthier because they're not putting chemicals on the ground. But tillage kills just as many invertebrates and affects the homes of the soil microbiome. We have a lot of data on what tillage does to soil functioning. And so we need to be, I think, holistic. I've seen organic farms with very healthy soil. I've seen organic farms with the most horrible, unhealthy soil I've ever seen in my life. And that particular farm tilled 12 times a year, Ken. It was insane. It was compact. I couldn't even get a shovel into the ground. And I've seen conventional systems that look pretty dang good to me. And I've seen conventional systems that are embarrassing and scary and sad as a soil scientist. So aggregate stability can be related to tillage. In our North American project to evaluate soil health measurements, we found that aggregate stability improved due to cover cropping only. We found that aggregate stability improved due to reduced tillage, but it didn't have to be no-till. That it just reducing the tillage, there was a measurable signal in the improvement in aggregate stability. But I'm not going to sit here and argue with you that tillage is good for aggregate stability. It is certainly not. But you know, something that I really have taken for granted as a soil physicist before I started at the Soil Health Institute, I've been here for 4 years. I've been really impressed by farmers that just have reduced tillage. They're using cover crops to help with their weed management, particularly in cotton, when a lot of these farmers have like triple resistant herbicide resistant weeds. They're having to go to um, uh, cover crops for weed management, and they're still plowing, and their aggregate stability is improving. They're not plowing as much or as aggressively, but they're still doing some. So I think what I focus on when I talk about soil health, I don't mention carbon. I think carbon is a co-benefit of soil health. I talk about functioning. And what I like to talk about, ask the farmer, is like, what are your problems out here? Is it herbicide resistant weeds? Is it erosion? Is it water erosion? Is it wind erosion? Is it compaction? What is the main problem that we need to fix? And then we go find a solution for that. And the beautiful thing to it is that it's always a soil health management practice, but it's not the same one or the same application. One of our agronomists who's worked in soil health for like 40 years, he'll always say, I never tell a farmer to cover crop. I always tell a farmer to solve a problem. And the choice of cover crop depends on, are you trying to increase carbon and biomass? Are you trying to control weeds? Are you trying to deal with a compaction problem? Are you dealing with an emergent problem? Is there a problem with drought resilience? Like, let's first define the problem, and then let's work to find something to solve that problem. And then Ken, I think as you agree, if you treasure it, you measure it, then you're going to try to measure change in that problem. So our basic recommended measurements of aggregate stability, respiration, and carbon concentration all tended to respond positively to soil health management systems. But if I was working with a farmer that had penetration resistance problems, or compaction, I get a penetrometer out there, and I would be measuring penetration resistance to help my farmer deal with compaction. And I would also think about controlled traffic to help my farmer deal with compaction. So, I think you asked me to comment. Hopefully I said something useful in there that, we're really thinking about problem solving, not prescriptive. Can we increase carbon? Can we increase aggregate stability? It's like, what's the problem today? And let's figure out a way to solve it. It doesn't require expensive ag input.
I just have a
Okay, Chris.
quick comment or question, I guess. Sorry, George, I'm gonna cut you off. You're talking about cover crops being, one of these major tools, but for an environment like us where we're actually rain-fed limited and cover crops are very difficult to establish without irrigation. How does that work, and where would that fit?
What I know is there's some very good research out of the rolling plains of Texas. Not only they're rainfall limited, but they have really, really hot summers. And what they have found, that was a corn cotton rotation, and they did cover cropping and no-till for, I think it was 8 years, and they measured water, and they've done this in the high plains of Texas too. If you're interested in the paper, the author is Paul Delaune, Delaune. And Paul found if they used a little bit of irrigation water to get the cover crop to come up, that the cover crop used water in the soil surface, but it was able to capture rainfall. In Texas, we don't have heavy frost like you guys have, but it was able to capture more water during the fallow season, so that on average, there was more water in the soil profile for the cash crop using cover crops. And I know that just seems completely insane, but that's what the data say. And they were also finding more yield resilience in the cash crop. In fact, there was 1 year during that study where the control, they couldn't harvest anything, but they were still able to harvest in the cover crop system because of deeper soil moisture. So there is evidence out there that in a rain-fed system, even when you're water limited, that a cover crop if managed appropriately, will help you capture water and bank it for your cash crop during the growing season.
That'd probably be true if you could establish it. That's our problem in Southern Alberta. Go ahead, George.
Yeah, I
Yes,
mean,
so our High Plains farmers, they're, they look at forecasts and they don't do cover crops every year, but they will talk about adding some water to get a cover crop up if they think that there's going to be enough water over the winter to sustain it. So
yeah.
I think it's all local.
One of the biggest issues with establishing cover crop in southern Alberta is the fact that we usually get a killing frost by late September.
Yeah.
And so there's not enough time. Is even under irrigation. I've had lots of growers who are trying to get cover crops growing, because most of the growers I work with have irrigation, and they're trying to get cover crops going. But yeah, it's you're lucky to get one, some of the winter wheat and fall rye to have 1 or 2 leaves going into the winter. So that's the issue there. And I guess, you mentioned about issues. The biggest issue I have with my growers, mainly because most of them use irrigation, is water infiltration rates. How fast we can get the water into the soil based on how fast it comes out of the pivot. We have way too much water that runs off a field, especially if there's any sort of topography in the field.
That sounds like your cover crop could really help that if you could get one established. So I have 2 points about that. University of Wisconsin has some really nice research on using perennial cover crops. And 2, I also know some folks in colder climates, they will seed before they harvest.
Yeah, and we've used those methods here as well. A couple of my growers, especially in situations with the edible beans, where they're pulled and they'll actually seed. They'll seed the strips where the windrow isn't right after they pull it. Again, we're barely getting, like last year, this past fall, we had some really good growing conditions. We didn't get a frost till the end of October, basically. So it's some very good growth on cover crop, but unfortunately that's not predictable and reliable, and that doesn't happen every year. So
our
it's
farmers say that they can get a cover crop once every 2 or 3 years and they're pretty happy with it.
So, but no, I appreciate your presentation. Definitely gives us something to think about. And it's again, thanks.
Well, George, I actually appreciate your comments a lot too, because these things are not easy. And I think, you probably also know that to figure them out, it takes farmers with a lot of tenacity, tolerance of ambiguity, and some desire to make it happen. That's one of the things that we really try to do at the Soil Health Institute when we're working in an area, is find that farmer that has been successful and have them share their troubleshooting tips and their methods. And it sounds like that's exactly what you do too, right? You're just working it out and figuring out what works. And I think that is the brain trust and the brain capital that we need in our agricultural systems, is people that are determined to try to figure out if, how it can work and if it can work. So,
all right, there's a couple more questions actually in the Feed Loop chat. If you don't mind, I'll just pose them to you. I'm a rancher from southeastern Alberta with both tame pasture, mostly crested wheatgrass and brome, and native pasture. Do you have any practical ideas for building up the carbon soil health on this land, especially the tame pasture?
I think rotational grazing is important. You want to really maintain that photosynthesis. And I would also think that getting some legumes going in the pasture gets more carbon, get more biomass built up with your pasture seeds. Those are some of the practices, probably something you're already aware of. But I think the way you think about it is you want healthy plants with good root systems. And however high you're cutting that plant off is about how the depth to which your root system is healthy. So the taller you can get your plant to grow, the deeper and healthier that root system is. And the way you get carbon in your soil is photosynthesis, CO2 assimilation, root exudates. So you want to manage for a very healthy, thriving photosynthetic system. And I think that that's why like this mob grazing and this rotational grazing is so beneficial to pasture health. It's just because the plant gets tall, so the roots are invested in, and then they're grazed down, but then they can grow back. And so the roots aren't sheared. Like one of the things like in lawn and turf management is a problem is when you continually cut your lawn really, really short, then the roots also get very, very short and unhealthy. And that's like one of the things that like turf managers have to deal with at golf courses and things like that. So, you know, just kind of think of that concept and think about how you're managing your grass.
And there's one more question. If CO2 burst is a good measure of a healthy soil, wouldn't that indicate sequestering carbon for carbon markets makes a soil unhealthy?
No, okay, so a CO2 burst is really just measuring the microbial activity. When we measure CO2 bursts, it's in the lab. So we dried the soil. We've killed a lot of microbes when we've dried that soil. And now we're re-wetting that soil. And we're just looking for microbes that will come alive quickly and eat up a lot of the dead microbes. So we're really just having some sort of very synthetic, very controlled measurement of microbial activity. And yes, active microbes eat carbon, but active microbes also cycle nutrients, and they help create more stable soil structure so that you can get more water into the system, and then you have nutrients, and so your plant grows and you have more photosynthesis, more root exudate, more carbon into your system. So you want a big number on your CO2 burst.
Okay, well, I thank you very much for your time. Appreciate you making it work for us today.
I really apologize, you guys. This is not my A game today, and I know you all have made time to be here, and I really do apologize. I hope you got something useful out of this.
Yeah, so we will wrap it up for the day. Big thank you to all of the attendees for sticking it out. I hope you enjoyed the presentations as much as I did. A thank you to all of our sponsors, and a huge thank you to all the speakers for sharing their extensive knowledge with us. On behalf of Farming Smarter, we wish you the rest of a great evening, and Merry Christmas, Happy New Year to everybody. In case we don't see you, we'll see you in the new year.